Hey folks, welcome back. We are on to Chapter 3, Biological Psychology. Our textbook is Introduction to Psychology, 12th edition, James Collette. So like last chapter, which was kind of foundational to understanding the rest of the stuff we're doing, this chapter is also very much foundational to understanding the rest of the stuff that we are going to be doing. So we're going to be learning essentially about the nervous system and the endocrine system. Our experience, our thoughts, everything is created by these two systems, our mood, our ability to control our body. So we need to know the different structures of the brain. We need to know neurons, how they work, how they communicate. We need to know about we need to know about hormones. So that's basically what we're going to be getting into today. All right, chapter objectives. Let's scoot this over here. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify the main structures of a neuron, describe the action potential, state the all or none law of the action potential, describe communication at synapses, describe how drugs affect behavior by changing action at synapses, distinguish among classes of drugs such as stimulants, hallucinogens, anxiolytics, and opiates. Explain why a drug may have one effect immediately and a different effect hours later. Explain why scientists favor the position called monism. Cite examples of how brain damage affects behavior. Describe methods of measuring brain activity. So as always, there is far more to cover in a chapter than is really possible, but we're just going to do our best, and you guys just absorb as much as you can. We are also going to be citing examples of brain plasticity, discussing the binding problem, outlining basic principles of genetics, discussing epigenetics as a mechanism of influencing development, explaining how researchers estimate heritability, and describe the assumptions and goals of evolutionary psychology. All right, that's a lot. Let's get right in. Part 1 of this chapter, Unit 1, Neurons and Behavior. And in the YouTube playlist, I will include some videos that will kind of show animations of how these neurons work and stuff, so that may be more helpful than me just talking about it. Okay, neurons, cells of the nervous system that receive information and transmit it to other cells by conducting electrical impulses. Cerebral cortex and associated areas have 12 to 15 billion neurons. Cerebellum has about 70 billion neurons. So we're looking at about 80 plus billion neurons in the human brain, each one having about 10,000 connections. So the brain is a very complex system. In addition to the neuron cells, there are also glia cells that support the neurons in many ways, such as insulating them, synchronizing activity among neighboring neurons, and removing waste products. So this is what a neuron looks like. That's an actual picture. Here is a drawing. So we are looking at essentially three main parts: the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. Here is the cell body, this little globby thing in the middle. Dendrites connect to the axons of other neurons. Right? So this neuron is connecting with many other neurons. It's receiving information, and based on the information coming into it, it's deciding whether to initiate an action potential. An action potential is a flow of electricity that goes down this thing here called an axon. It's insulated by a myelin sheath. These are the terminal branches of the axon, and as that electrical signal makes its way to the end, it causes these branches of the axon, these synapses, to release neurotransmitters or to release a signal of some kind. Okay. And how does this electrical signal travel? Well, basically, it's called an action potential, and we see this kind of positive charge sweeping down through this axon. It has to do with the difference in the amount of sodium inside the cell versus outside. Sodium has an electrical charge, so the sodium rushes in and then is pumped back out at the end, so it can all happen all over again. Pretty fancy stuff. Again, the video will help illustrate some of this. During action potential, sodium gates open and sodium ions enter the axon, bearing a positive charge. After an action potential, the sodium gates close. At that point, and open at the next point along the axon. As the sodium gates close, potassium gates open, and potassium ions flow out of the axon. So, more about synapses. Synapse is the specialized junction between one neuron and another. Terminal button, or the presynaptic ending, the bulge at the end of the axon, from which the axon releases a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is a chemical that activates receptors on other neurons. The postsynaptic neuron is the neuron on the receiving end of the synapse. So, just to summarize again, neurons use electrochemical communication. The electrical part is that charge that travels down the axon. When it gets to the bottom, that electrical charge stimulates the release of various neurotransmitters into the other neuron that is receiving the charge. Then that neuron then does other things. So you have this kind of constant chain reaction of electricity flying around in our brain through all the different neural networks, causing different neurotransmitters to be released in this very, very complicated dance. And now you see why people can have mental health challenges, because it's very complicated. And if something even minor goes off, it dramatically affects the functioning of the organism. A little bit more about synapses. So here we get a little more detailed view of what's happening at the end of the axon, right? A synapse is a junction of a presynaptic, that is a message sending cell, and a postsynaptic, that is the message receiving cell. The terminal button at the end of the tip of the presynaptic axon contains the neurotransmitter. Here is the terminal button. This is the presynaptic neuron, or the message sending cell. Postsynaptic neuron, message receiving. These neurotransmitters go from this one down into that one. It's sort of like a lock and key mechanism. They find a little hole to fit into, a little spot to wedge into, and they do their job. Eventually what happens is these neurons get released from this cell. They get released back into this gap here, and then they get reabsorbed by the presynaptic neuron. So all the different drugs we have that have psychoactive properties, whether we're talking about nicotine, whether we're talking about caffeine, whether we're talking about heroin or methamphetamines or cannabis or Tylenol or anything, are all affecting this process somehow. Some drugs are causing the release of more neurotransmitters. Some drugs are preventing the reuptake. So the neurotransmitters get released, the drug kind of sneaks in and goes up in here and blocks them. So when this cell releases them, they hang out here longer and then get reabsorbed here. Right, so it's all about modifying the amount of transmitter activity when we're talking about psychoactive drugs. Some drugs mimic our endogenous drugs, so like LSD are very similar to a certain kind of serotonin. Marijuana or cannabis is similar to cannabinoids, endocannabinoids found in our brain and body. Right, so all the different drugs we have either mimic or enhance or inhibit various neurotransmitters. Poisons, some poisons might dramatically flood the brain with certain neurotransmitters, causing muscle spasms.
Okay.
Okay. All right, we'll get more into that later, though. Neurotransmitters and behavior. The brain has dozens of neurotransmitters, 26 types of gamma amino butyric acid receptors, 7 families of serotonin receptors. Each receptor controls a of behavior. Increase or decrease of a particular transmitter or receptor results in disorders like Parkinson's disease. Symptoms alter behavior, including slow movement, tremors, depressed mood, trace day or decrease in neurotransmitter dopamine. So this slide has a lot of random facts, but I'll try and so GABA, a gamma aminobutyric acid, is an important neurotransmitter. It's sometimes called the brain's braking system. People that have problems with their GABA system tend to experience anxiety, because anxiety is a failure of the brain's braking system. Too many thoughts, can't slow them down. Heart rate too fast, can't slow that down. Right? Our brain isn't able to kind of keep things at the optimal level. But it's not as simple as GABA, right? There's lots of different types of GABA receptors. There's lots of different types of serotonin receptors. So we mentioned psilocybin and LSD. They're similar to serotonin, but they seem to affect a particular type to cause that particular result. Right? So a wide variety of effects can happen depending on which drug affects serotonin or GABA receptor. Parkinson's disease is tied to dopamine. Now, dopamine, people with ADHD have dopamine issues, so stimulates help them concentrate. But Parkinson's disease is also related to dopamine because dopamine has not just, but also movement. So the tremors that are related to dopamine, Parkinson's disease. Okay, so let's look at some specific drugs, classes of drugs, and their effects on the brain. One class of drugs are stimulants. Maybe you all are familiar with them because maybe you all had some coffee this morning. Coffee would be a stimulant. Alertness and activity. Often they will block protein the presynaptic neuron uses to reabsorb dopamine or serotonin, so they're preventing the reuptake of dopamine or serotonin. These can include amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine, caffeine, and nicotine. A lot of these drugs work on the dopamine system, including amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine. ADP, I believe it's called, adenosine triphosphate, or maybe that's not quite the right acronym. But essentially, there is a thing in our brain that makes us sleepy. Caffeine blocks that neurotransmitter from producing sleepiness, alertness. Hallucinogens are another category of drug. Hallucinogens are a bit different. So typically you've got your stimulants and you've got your depressants, and they have pretty standard effects, right? Your stimulants raise activity in your brain. Your depressants decrease activity in your brain. Classic depressants, we just talked about stimulants, would be alcohol and opiates and some other anti-anxiolytic drugs, like say Xanax, for example. Hallucinogenic drugs are a bit different. They're neither stimulants nor depressants. They can have a range of effects. They can have a stimulating effect. They can have a depressing effect. They can have an effect more unpredictable. And not all stimulants are the same. Marijuana is considered a stimulant, as is LSD, but they do very different things. The main thing is that a stimulant does not have the exact same effect. Two people could smoke pot and could start feeling paranoid. LSD, we mentioned 2 receptors. LSD can cause panic attacks or flashbacks or psychotic reactions, but it can also cause many beautiful experiences. There was a lot of research done in the 50s and 60s with these psychedelic drugs. Culture changed, research stopped, but it's now to be starting up again. And most of the most promising drug testing and under development are psychedelic related. LSD and related psychedelics reduce our default mode network activity, which reduces our sense of self and can allow breakthroughs that may be difficult to attain with traditional psychotherapy. And a lot of studies showing lasting results in anxiety and depression 3-6 months later, a year later. MDMA releases dopamine, stimulates neurons that release dopamine, but produces a very different effect than, say, cocaine, which is more of just a high effect. MDMA produces a lot of feelings. It's been used in conjunction with sufferers of PTSD, where they're able to talk about and revisit traumatic events with a therapist and sort of reprocess those events. Helpful. There are other hallucinogens, of course, including ketamine, which is a popular drug these days and is showing a lot of benefit for treatment-resistant depression. Other hallucinogens include ayahuasca, which I'm not, but people are doing a lot of experimenting with that. And there are some others. Okay. Other commonly used and abused drugs, depressants. Depressants decrease arousal. Alcohol is the most common depressant. Alcohol you can sort of think of as a blanket on our brain, sort of takes everything down. That anxiety, that social anxiety, have a few drinks, that starts to come down. You start to relax, you're feeling more outgoing, social. Of course, try to drive, and your ability to drive, your reaction time is also slowed down, right? Your judgment is also slowed down. Your inhibitions are slowed down. So maybe it's easier to talk to the boy or girl at the bar that you want to talk to, but you might also be more likely to get into a fist fight at that bar because your inhibitions are just sort of generally lowered. Anxiolytic drugs are also depressant, Valium, Xanax, or Hypnol, GHB. Narcotics can cause drowsiness, insensitivity to pain, decreased responsiveness. These are also a kind of depressant, right? And opiates can be natural or synthetic. Very dangerous to mix alcohol and opiates. Opiates by themselves can, of course, cause death. They depress the activity of the brain. They depress pain signals. That can be physical pain as well as emotional pain, but they also depress things like your heart rate, which is essentially how you die on opiates. So dangerous to mix opiates and okay, other commonly abused drugs. Sometimes soften pain, less powerful from opiates. Again, doesn't work for everyone. Being a hallucinogen, THC is the primary psychoactive substance in cannabis, although there are other compounds, CBD most notably, but other related compounds to THC. THC does impair attention and memory in the short term and in the long term. So there are some downsides to it, but marijuana is approved in most states as a medical treatment for pain and appetite and a wide variety of other things. It's now becoming approved recreationally. Probably won't be more than 2 to 4 years before it's decriminalized across the United States. Medically used to reduce nausea, suppress tremors, reduce pressure in the eyes, decrease cell loss after a stroke. Attaches to receptors that are abundant in the brain, especially those located in the presynaptic neuron. So our brain does have an endocannabinoid system. All our cells in our body have a range of effects. That sort of positive, happy feeling you get has to do with the fact that marijuana inhibits something that inhibits the release. So by inhibiting the thing that's inhibiting the release of dopamine, indirectly you're getting a release of dopamine, which feels good, but that's not the only effect. People used to think that the runner's high was due to adrenaline that was being released when people go for long runs. It's actually the endocannabinoid system kicking in. Endocannabinoid system. Okay, here is some examples of how drugs can work in the synapses. A few examples. Amphetamine increases the release of dopamine and serotonin. So does MDMA or ecstasy. Right, so you're getting an increased release of dopamine and serotonin. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine and serotonin after their release. Methylphenidate and many antidepressants slowly. So these serotonin neurotransmitters get released, and then the cocaine is going to block the reuptake so that they stay down here. Benzodiazepines, tranquilizers help receptors. So benzodiazepines are sort of enhancing the GABA activity, which is the braking system, which is going to reduce anxiety. Alcohol also facilitates GABA receptor activity. So those are just a few examples of drugs. The internet's a magical place. You can always Google, how do opiates work? How does cocaine work? And you will get your answer. Okay. Unit 3 within our third chapter, brain and behavior. So let's begin to look at some of the components of the nervous system. Of course, we've been talking about some of them in that we have been talking about neurons, which are the basic building block of our nervous system. Let's kind of put it all together now. 2 important points to remember when studying the brain. You use all of your brain. Consciousness is inseparable from the physical brain, the concept otherwise known as monism. We're presuming for this course that the brain produces our conscious experience until we have some evidence otherwise. That is the assumption that we are going to make, and all evidence thus far seems to point in that direction. How exactly consciousness is produced in the brain is somewhat mysterious still. What consciousness is somewhere. Maybe we will figure it out in the near future. Maybe not. The central nervous system refers to the brain, the spinal cord, and it communicates with the rest of the body. Really, everything else is just kind of designed to keep this stuff alive and also to gather information for this stuff. But that's basically what you are. You are your eyes and your brain and your nervous system. Your bones, your muscles, all that stuff is sort of like your brain and spinal cord are wearing. Peripheral nervous system refers to the nerves connecting the spinal cord with the rest of the body. Here is a little diagram. We've got our central nervous system, we've got our brain and our spinal cord. Here is a brain with some different parts of the brain shown. Let's zoom in one. We've got our cerebral cortex, this wrinkly bit up here. It is wrinkly because there's a lot of it. In other animals that have less brain, it is smooth on the top. So the wrinkles is to fit more in. We've got our corpus callosum here. We've got a thalamus, a hypothalamus, a pituitary gland. This is part of our endocrine system. So that neurons are back here. So the hatching guide, this stuff here with the lines going this way, this part and this part, that is our hind brain. This stuff here is our mid, and the rest of it is our forebrain. So what does all that mean? Essentially, our hind brain is, evolutionarily speaking, the oldest part of our brain. You call it the reptile brain, which may be useful, maybe not useful. Point is that that is, evolutionarily speaking, our oldest. So a lot of our most basic activities, the automatic things like our automatic response, our breathing, our heart rate, the way our brain monitors our body temperature and keeps us alive, like all the unconscious functions that keep us alive are back here. The midbrain tends to be sort of intermediate functions, and these are the sort of evolutionarily newer functions. We are the only animal with a cerebral cortex that is this dense, right? So this is kind of the part of our brain that makes us the most human. So it's kind of front to back, kind of evolutionarily oldest, most basic stuff, higher level cognitive functions like self-concept, self-control, planning, decision-making. That stuff is in the cortex, and especially over here in this prefrontal cortex. All right, cerebral cortex, 3 major divisions of the vertebrate brain, hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. Our brain additionally is divided into hemispheres, the left and right halves of the forebrain. So our brain is cut in half essentially. There's a thick band of neurons called the corpus callosum that connects them. They control sensation and movement on opposite sides of the body. So the left side of our body controls, our left brain controls the right side of our body, right brain controls our left side of our body. So if you have a stroke, say, on one side of your brain, you may have trouble of the body. Okay, when we look at our cerebral cortex, we have various lobes. Frontal lobe here, planning of movements, working memory, events that happened very recently. We've got the primary motor cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, the parietal lobe, this is body sensations, occipital lobe, visual sensations, and the temporal lobe is for hearing. There's not, for the most part, there's like specialization within the brain, but it's not like a one-to-one kind of thing, right? Information does go from our eyes directly to the back of our brain, but it doesn't mean like that is equal for image processing. And the brain can adopt after it's been damaged. It can start to use other parts of the brain for new things, but this is kind of the general organization of these that they do. Okay. So let's take a look at the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is located at the sides of the head, the main area for hearing and some aspects of vision. Damage causes deficits in vision and the ability to recognize blindness. On this chart, or on this image, we also have the amygdala, little thing right there. If you've got an anxiety disorder, this little bad boy is your problem. Of course, he's not your original problem. Something else was your problem, but this is where that problem is stored in your brain, so to speak. It's not a slight exaggeration. It's actually all over your brain. But this is essentially our fear center of our brain. Sometimes I like to think about this as kind of like a seesaw, your frontal cortex and your amygdala. If your amygdala is way heavier than your frontal cortex, and it's, do kids even play on seesaws back in my day? You sat in the seesaw, the heavier kid could kind of weigh down the kid. If you're even, they could kind of go up and down. We want our prefrontal cortex, which often serves as an inhibitory function, to be stronger than our amygdala. We don't want to sort of only be a victim to whatever our first emotional response is, especially if our emotional responses are sometimes not as required of a given. Parietal and frontal lobes. Parietal lobe, anterior to the occipital lobe, specialized for body senses. Primary somatosensory cortex, cells sensitive to touch. Damage interferes with emotional response and spatial attention. Our frontal lobe, anterior pole of the brain. Primary motor cortex controls fine movements. Anterior sections, the prefrontal cortex, are important for memory of what just happened and what to do next. Mirror neurons are active during movement and mimicking movements. When we see someone, say, throw a punch, the neurons responsible for throwing a punch in our own brain are active, even if we're just watching someone do that. So you can actually get better at a sport by watching someone do that, because your neurons are getting practice doing that movement in a way. Not to say you can get amazing without ever doing anything, but of learning and practice. Okay, moving on and up. Two hemispheres and their connections. As we said, brain is divided into left and right. Each brain hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. There is some degree of specialization, although again, it's not 100%. Left hemisphere dies in language for most people, and there are two areas on that side of the brain. One is called the Wernicke's, called the Broca's area. These are responsible for receptive language, basically hearing language and speaking language. Right hemisphere is more, might say, or spatial relationships, and also interpreting emotional expressions. The left constantly exchange information. Interesting study, people who meditate regularly have better connection across their corpus callosum. People also tend to improve their connection between the hemispheres of their brain as they age. Corpus callosum, set of axons that connect the right and left hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Cannot share information. Sometimes there will be a brain surgery which will cut the corpus callosum as a way of preventing seizures. Seizures are essentially a spike of electrical activity in the brain, so that can be one way of ensuring you get less of those spikes. Some different ways to measure what's happening in the brain. Psychology is a challenging science because it is hard to measure what is actually happening in the brain. As I said, there are 80 to 100 billion neurons in a given brain. That is an impossibly large number of neurons, each of them having 10,000 or so connections, which, 80 billion, that's, an 8 with 10 zeros after that, times that by 10,000. Now you've got an 8 with 14 zeros after it. That's a lot of connections, a lot of activities, a lot of different neurotransmitters being released into different types of receptors. There's just even one neurotransmitter, serotonin, has 7 different receptors. It's hard. And the tools we have are somewhat limited up to this point, but here's what we got. Electroencephalograph measures and amplifies tiny electrical changes on essentially those little wires with like little circles, or a cap with a bunch of wires. But this is only measuring electrical activity on the surface of our brain. Magnetoencephalograph records magnetic changes, not really used. Positron emission tomography records radioactive activity of various brain areas emitted from injected chemicals. So essentially, you're going to inject someone with a radioactive substance that will show up on a scanner. It will go into, and essentially what you're doing is you're measuring, you're able to see which areas of the brain are getting increased blood flow. So it's basically just giving you a general sense of what areas of the brain are most active at a given time. But you could have a few neurons firing. They might not be the main activity happening, and it could have profound effects, right? So this is, again, not, it's kind of like trying to study, the sun or whatever. It's limited. fMRI, procedure that uses magnetic detectors outside the head to compare the with and without oxygen in different brains. MRI does similar thing, but a functional one essentially can work while a person is actually doing activities, and MRI just can measure certain things while the person is essentially stationary. So this is, again, just measuring blood flow to different parts of the brain, not super precise. Now, if this is all we have, how do we really know what different parts of the brain do? A lot of that is done with animals, where we can actually cut their brains open. We can remove parts of their brains to see what happens. We can stimulate parts of their brains with electrodes to see what happens. And then also, in some cases, with people who have had traumatic brain injuries. If this is all we were limited to, much less. Subcortical areas of the brain, we've got our hypothalamus, structure below the thalamus, important for hunger, thirst, temperature, regulation, behaviors. This is part of our midbrain. Again, these are very much animal things. Animals have to do all these things. Animals look for food, they look for mates, they satisfy their hunger and their thirst. They have to regulate their body temperature. Pons, a brain area that controls certain muscles of the head. Medulla, a brain area that controls muscles of the head, some sensations from the head, and output to the stomach and the intestines. Spinal cord, structure that controls the muscles from the neck down. Reflex, response to a stimulus. Here is a sort of cross-section of the spine. This is the back part. And what we're seeing essentially is the spinal column with the nerves that are the motor nerves that are coming out of the spine and going into different parts of the body. Cerebellum is part of the hindbrain. It's responsible for coordinated movements, behaviors that require aim or timing, voluntary eye movements, learned responses, emotional expression. Right? Animals have to, it's part of our hindbrain. We've got our central nervous system, which is essentially the different parts of our brain and our neurons. Okay, well, what the heck else is going on with our brain? What else does our brain do? Well, a big part of our brain is this autonomic nervous system. And then sort of related to the brain, the functioning of the brain, these are kind of aspects, important kind of things that modify these sort of broader functions, the basic functions of our brain and the different parts of our brain. The autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system are going to sort of modulate how things that are happening in our brain are going to feel, or what's going to happen in our brain, things like that. Okay. So autonomic nervous systems, things like our heart and our lungs, automatic. Could just call it the automatic. Doesn't need to be called autonomic, but that's just what we call it. And it has two parts, sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic is responsible for, and fight or flight should be in quotation marks because it's really more accurate to talk about fight or flight or freeze or fawn. These are responses in our thoughts and our behaviors, things that people do when they're under threat. So they fight back, they run away, they might freeze to avoid being seen or eaten or predated upon, or fawn, which is sort of people-pleasing behavior. So these are all, and people that experience a lot of trauma throughout their life, they are one or all four of these, going back and forth, four of these. Parasympathetic, sometimes called rest and digest. It is the part of is the way of functioning that is active when we are relaxed. It often kicks in after we eat food to help us digest. We're hanging out with our friends, we're at home watching TV. Now, of course, you can be laying on the couch and be freaking out with anxiety, so you're not going to be in parasympathetic, you're going to be in your sympathetic. So it's not just about what you're doing, but hopefully if you're at home after work or school, laying on the couch watching TV, hopefully you're in this parasympathetic state. And important thing to note is we do have some conscious control over this. So if you go to a therapist and you have trauma, you have anxiety disorder of some kind, depression, a lot of the work is going to be figure out how to spend more time in this rest and digest parasympathetic, less time in this fight or flight sympathetic state. Okay, related to our nervous system is our endocrine system. These are a series of glands that produce hormones and release them into our blood. So neurotransmitters have immediate effects, right? So you smoke a cigarette and get dopamine released into your brain, it's going to feel good. If you experience a stressful situation, your body's going to start releasing cortisol. Now, that may not immediately affect your behavior. Now, you may get neurotransmitters immediately in a stressful situation. The cortisol is going to happen on a slower time frame, a time frame of mixed years. Hormones are chemicals released by glands, conveyed to the blood, and later the activity in the organs. Let's see what's on the next slide. Yeah. Here are some glands of the nervous system, the endocrine system. So let's see, let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure this little thing out. So we've got a lot of nerves going into different organs, right? So we've got our vagus nerve, which is going into our heart. I think that's our colon there, into our lungs, into our stomach, liver. I think that's a gallbladder or kidney, etc. Colon. We've got our ovaries and testes and stuff down here. So we've got all these nerves, and these nerves are coming out from our spinal column into these different things here. We've got cranial nerves, we've got cervical nerves, we've got thoracic. Not really talking about the endocrine system here, though. It's not. Let's see what's on the next one. If there is a next one. No. Okay. Endocrine system, there's the pituitary gland. There is the thyroid gland. Pituitary gland, essentially in our throat area. Insulin, which is produced by your pancreas, is a hormone. You've got cortisol, which is produced by, recorded a whole bunch of these videos today, so my brain is officially here. Cortisol is produced by something, which I'm not at the moment. That is okay. Very important hormone for behavior. And then we have our sex hormones produced by our sex organs, right? So the gonads, testes, ovaries produce estrogen, testosterone, and those are also very important factors in behavior. If you give any organism, whether it's a male human, female human, male dog, female dog, monkey, cat, cow, anything, if you give them testosterone, they are going to become competitive and aggressive. It's not to say men are not responsible for their behavior. They certainly are. But just to illustrate that these hormones can have very powerful effects, whether we're talking about cortisol, whether we're talking about insulin, whether we're talking about if you're talking about the hormones produced by our thyroid glands, which give us energy. These all have profound effects here, things like that. Okay. Let's zoom out a little bit because that generally works and see what we got. Okay, experience and brain plasticity. Plasticity is change caused by experience. Experiences alter brain connections. Prolonged, unusual experiences change the brain in profound ways. Undifferentiated cells, stem cells, develop into new neurons in brain areas such as the hippocampus, and this continues throughout life. So anytime we have an experience that changes us physically, right? When we learn something, when we learn concepts are stored in our brain. A concept is stored in our brain in a pattern of connection between neurons. When we learn a new concept, what's happening is neurons are now growing together. If you go out and learn a new skill, like shooting a basketball, you never played basketball. Now you go out and you're shooting free throws over and over again. Maybe you're learning to jump rope. Maybe you take up yoga. Maybe you start dancing. Maybe you start playing a new musical instrument. Maybe you're taking new classes. You're having new experiences. All those things are going to change your brain. They're going to change the structure of the way the neurons in your brain are. Brain can learn and grow. If it didn't, we'd be in trouble. Social neuroscience is the study of the biological bases of social behavior. Oxytocin is an interesting neurotransmitter and hormone. It functions as both. It's a hormone released by women when nursing a baby and by both men and women during sexual activity. The effects of oxytocin are not always prosocial. So interestingly, and there's actually a gendered effect. It's not mentioned here, but it affects men and women differently. So men can actually become more possessive when they're, so essentially when they're in love. For women, it's sort of a more straightforward, nurturing thing. When men are in love and want, feeling a lot of oxytocin released in the presence of a female partner and children, that can actually lead to protective, controlling, even aggressive behaviors, right? So important to understand how this stuff works. And the brain's super complicated. There's so many neurotransmitters. We're just starting to learn some of them. The binding problem. This is the question of how separate areas combine to produce a unified perception of a single object, right? So our brain is lots of different things. A term that's used by neuroscientists is parallel processing. Our brain is always doing a lot of different things. How is it that we experience it all as one coherent whole? Well, good question. If there's any clear answer at this point. Genetics and evolutionary psychology. Okay, just, a minor topic here at the end of this chapter. Only 13 more slides, folks, 12 more. Let's get some basic principles of genetics in the books, and then we can be done, I believe. Chromosomes. These are the strands of hereditary material. This is what carries the information that is used to build you and me and every living organism on this planet. Genes are inherited structures that control chemical reactions and that direct development. Some genes are dominant. These genetic effects that appears even with only a single copy of the gene. Recessive are genetic effect that appears only if the dominant gene is absent. So if one parent has the dominant gene, the other parent has the recessive, the child will get the dominant version of that gene. If both parents have the recessive version, right? So brown eyes, for example, is a dominant gene. So if one parent, the child should have brown eyes. But when both parents have blue eyes, the child should have blue eyes. All right, sex-linked and sex-limited genes. Mammals, sex chromosomes are known as X and Y. X chromosomes, female have 2 per cell, male have 1. Males have 1 per cell and females have none. So one spot in the genome, females have an XX and males have an XY. So when a sperm and an egg come together, the female always contributes an X. The male contributes either an X or a Y. If the fertilized egg gets the X from the male, then it's the baby's going to be female. If the fertilized egg gets a Y from the male, then the baby is going to have an XY in that spot and therefore be a male. Of course, there are other combinations like XXY and XYY and things like that. So gender is not just male and female. There are intersexed and things like that. Sex-linked genes located only on the X or Y chromosome. Sex-limited genes refer to genes that occur equally in both sexes but exert its effect mainly or entirely in one or the other. Fun fact, all babies start out as female and then sort of become turned into males. That's why men have nipples, but we just didn't get the female or feminizing hormones at the right stage of the birth process. But then you do get some males that do get some of the feminizing hormones or vice versa. And then you end up with more complicated gender cases. More complex view of genes. Okay. So now this is important. It's all important, but I think this is one of the more important sort of very practical things to understand about genes. And I think it's often not well understood. So Think about it this way. Think about a big switchboard. Your genes are all these different switches, all these possible things your body can do, right? It's the totality of what your body is capable of. So unless you have some very severe genetic disorder or limitation, every person is capable of building muscle when they exert, force, physical activity. And what does that mean, building muscle? So if you go to the gym and you start working out, you will build muscle. Well, what does that actually mean? What's happening? What's happening is your genome, your epigenetic situation, your epigenome is changing. Your body is now switching on certain portions of your genome that code for building muscle. Why do you build muscle more times than others? Well, it's because certain parts of your genome are more active than other parts. So our activities, the things we experience, the stressors we experience on a day-to-day basis, the physical activities, the things we're learning, are we reading books? Are we staring at a phone? Are we spending time in nature walking? Are we lifting weights? Are we stretching and working on our mobility? Are we having genuine human connections with others? All the things that are happening and what kinds of foods are we eating? Are we eating a lot of high protein foods? Are we eating a lot of fiber? Are we eating a lot of food with a lot of nutrients? Are we eating a low calorie diet? Are we eating a high calorie diet? All these things affect which parts of our genome are active, and that is called epigenetics, a newly emerging field that deals with changes in gene expression, right? So we've got our full genome, but at any given time, only some of those genes are being expressed. Well, environmental influences. Okay, estimating heritability in humans. Heritability is an estimate of the variance within a population that is due to heredity. Researchers estimate heritability through twin studies. Okay, so before we get to that, well, we want to know, to what extent is IQ or intelligence a product of genetics, and what extent is it a product of environment? And based on current estimates, it seems like IQ is about 50% heritable. So the child's IQ is about 50% determined by the genes of the parents' IQ essentially, but also 50% by the environment they're in. So you could easily have a situation where a child has a potential for a very high IQ, but their environment is very limited. Therefore, they never reach their potential, where someone with a more average potential reaches their full potential because their parents have a lot of money and they give them every opportunity to learn and things like that. One of the ways researchers study this is by looking at the differences between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins and siblings and general population, right? So comparing twins that are raised separately, whether they're monozygotic or dizygotic, can give us a sense of the role that genetics and environment plays, because essentially you can do twin studies where you can perfectly control for genes because they have the exact same genes, or they have 50% of the same genes, and then you can see what happens to them in different environments. Okay, how genes influence behavior, one of two. Based on studies of twins and adopted children, researchers have found at least moderate heritability for almost every behavior they've examined. So every single behavior has at least some genetic component. That's pretty impressive in and of itself. Genes affect behaviors by altering chemistry of the brain. They also exert indirect effects by influencing other organs that in turn influence behaviors. There's something called a multiplier effect, which is a tendency for a small initial advantage in some behavior, possibly genetic in origin, to lead to experiences that magnify the advantage. So say you've got a kid who's on the autism spectrum and a more neurotypical kid. The kid on the autism spectrum likes to be alone, likes to learn about how things work and how machines work and build engines or figure out how computers work, or likes computer programming or whatever it might be. Think about that child as a 5-year-old versus another child who might have the same IQ, but really likes to play football or soccer or baseball or whatever it is and hang out with his friends. They have the same IQ, but 10 years later, the 15-year-old autistic kid is, winning science competitions because he may have spent thousands of hours learning about his special interest. And this other kid maybe is a star of the varsity baseball team because he spent thousands of hours playing baseball. So motivation is a big factor in what happens to a person, their life, and the outcomes that are attained. Okay, PKU, inherited condition that if untreated impairs brain development. I swear some of these slides are kind of random. I don't understand why that's put in this slide. About 2% of people with European or Asian ancestry and almost no Africans have the recessive gene that leads to PKU. This could have to do with Neanderthal DNA. When you see a big difference between European and Asian ancestry and African ancestry, there's a good chance that has something to do with Neanderthal DNA because African people do not have any Neanderthal DNA, whereas Europeans and Asians do. One copy nearly harmless because the gene is recessive, but people with copies from both parents cannot metabolize phenylalanine, which is a common constituent of protein. Evolutionary psychology. Getting there, folks, getting there. Evolution is a gradual change in the frequency of various genes from one generation to the next. So, common misconception. Organisms do not evolve. No particular dog, cat, or human or chimpanzee evolves. We are born with our genetic makeup. We die with the same genetic makeup, right? But when you look at a group, when you look at the population level, we can say that maybe all the adults in a given population, they have a range of different sizes, for example. Some are big, some are small. Given the environment they live in, maybe it's very helpful to be large. So the large ones, they live longer, they make more babies, they're more successful, they fend off predators. Now we look at the second generation, and maybe they're not noticeably larger, but there's slightly more genes for increased size. 5, 10, 100 generations later, this species of this population is now larger in size, or faster, or smarter, or smaller, or have lighter hair, or darker hair, or more hair, or less hair, longer neck, shorter neck, longer tongue, brighter colors, spots, stripes, whatever it may be. All these things are subject to random variation. Over successive generations, populations can change. Okay, certain aspects of human behavior make no sense except as an evolutionary carryover from ancestors from whom the behavior was useful. Distinguishing between convincing evolutionary explanations and speculative explanations that await further research is important. Sometimes we tell stories, women were the gatherers and men were the hunters, and, therefore women should stay at home and cook and clean, and men should go out and, fight it out in Wall Street or whatever. We have to be careful with evolutionary psychology because it's quite likely that women in most places in prehistory were also involved in hunting, and men were also involved in gathering. And truth is that women had leadership roles in most traditional societies, right? So our evolutionary stories, sometimes they're just loosely tied to the evidence, and sometimes they represent our biases and stereotypes more than logic or evidence. Okay. We are going to skip the summary. It's been a long lecture, but we've been talking about the biological foundations of behavior. Below this video, I will add some other cool videos on the biology of human behavior, how neurons work, blah, blah, blah. So you can also check out those additional videos if you want more information. All right. Thanks for making it this far, and I'll talk